On November 25th, President-elect Donald Trump announced that due to the large influx of drugs like fentanyl into the US, he would impose a 10% tariff on goods from China once he takes office. He also planned to impose a 25% tariff on goods from Canada and Mexico. Trump explained that these countries have not taken sufficient action to prevent drugs like fentanyl from entering the US. He emphasized that the US had repeatedly discussed the issues with China, but the talks have been ineffective. After the announcement, Mexico's newly elected president Claudia Sheinbaum pointed out that her government had already developed a plan. This plan will step up efforts to block Chinese fentanyl from entering Mexico and stop the flow of illegal immigrants to the US-Mexico border. It will also promote the production of goods by Mexican companies to replace imports from China. Mexico's Secretary of Economy, Marcelo Ebrard, stated that the country would conduct a comprehensive search across all 32 states, including ports and airports, to target illegal goods coming from China. On November 28th, around 200 officials raided a shopping mall in Mexico City known for selling Chinese products. Over 260,000 items were seized, valued at 7.5 million pesos, around 370,000 USD. Meanwhile, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau held an emergency meeting with provincial leaders to discuss the situation. Canada decided to create a coordinated policy with the US to block fentanyl and illegal immigration from China. The Canadian Finance Ministry stated that the three countries under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement would align their policies toward China. This meant that Canada and Mexico would consider following the US's approach. Additionally, Trudeau flew to West Palm Beach, Florida to meet with Trump and personally express his commitment to the new policy. Commentators noted that Trump's move was aimed to bring Mexico and Canada back to the negotiating table, forcing them to cooperate in tackling the flow of Chinese goods and drugs that were harming North American markets. If these issues were resolved, punitive tariffs on Canada and Mexico would not be necessary, and the tariffs would instead fall solely on China. China is not happy about the development. The day after Trump's tariff announcement, Chinese Foreign Minister spokesperson Mao Ning stated that China had one of the strictest and most thorough drug control policies in the world. She argued that fentanyl was a problem for the US, not China, claiming that the fentanyl material China produced was for medicinal use. Once exported, it was misused as a drug. Therefore, she suggested that the US should focus on its own drug control issues. Fentanyl is a colorless, odorless synthetic opioid used in medical settings for pain relief, 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine. However, when abused, it can cause fatal respiratory failure. Criminal groups have used fentanyl to make illegal drugs, mixing it into counterfeit prescription pills, heroin, and increasingly into methamphetamine and cocaine. Many people who overdose on fentanyl do not realize that they're taking it. More than 90% of the raw materials needed to make fentanyl are sourced from China. These materials are exported to Mexico and Canada, where drugs cartels mix them into illicit drugs and smuggle them into the US, contributing to tens of thousands of deaths in the US each year. In 2023, fentanyl was responsible for at least 70,000 deaths in the US. Ann Milgram, the head of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, said in May that the U.S. is facing the most devastating drug crisis in our nation's history. Over the years, fentanyl has become a highly controversial issue in the U.S.-China trade and diplomatic relations, with many analysts predicting that the fentanyl problem could ignite a new round of tensions between the two countries. On November 19th, the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission recommended in its annual report that the U.S. Congress should revoke China's permanent normal trade relations status. Similarly, on November 14th, Congress John Molinar, chair of the U.S. House Select Committee of China, introduced a bill calling for the formal termination of China's PNTR status. With the Republican Party set to control Congress and the White House, there is a high likelihood that China's PNTR status will be revoked. Analysts believe that even before taking office, Trump has already set two major hurdles for the U.S.-China trade. First, China will be held responsible for the flow of fentanyl into the U.S., and all goods entering the U.S. from China will be subject to a 10% additional tax. Second, China will lose its PNTR status. PNTR, which replaced the former most favored nation status, meant that U.S. tariffs on Chinese products are usually much lower than those on goods from other countries. The average tariff for most favored nation status is around 2.2%, while non-MFN tariffs are about 42%. When Trump was president, he imposed about a 20% tariff on a large number of Chinese products using Section 301 of U.S. trade law. As a result, 48% of Chinese exports to the U.S. no longer enjoy the benefits of the MFN tariff rate. According to a report from the Peterson Institute of International Economics in September, by June 2023, the average U.S. tariff on products imported from China has risen to 19.3%, up from just 2.3% at the beginning of 2018. If China loses its PNTR status, the average tariff on Chinese goods could increase to over 60%, with the additional 10% penalty tariff on fentanyl. The total tariff on Chinese product could rise above 70%. Some Chinese economists argue that Trump's high tariff policies are harmful to both sides and could lead to rising U.S. prices, worsening inflation, and weaker trade. Chinese state media like the Global Times quoted Hu Jianguo, vice president of the China's WTO Research Association, who claimed that it would be difficult for the U.S. to revoke China's PNTR status because it would harm the U.S. economy and cause global economic instability. Experts have countered this, saying that increasing tariffs on China will not significantly hurt U.S. prices, but it will hurt Chinese exports. Many trade relationships could be replaced by alternatives, they argue. The U.S. Department of Commerce Bureau of Economics analysts report that U.S. exports hit a record high in 2023 and the trade deficit shrank by 18.7%. National Taiwan University political science professor Fan Jiazhong analyzed that the U.S. does not rely heavily on international trade, especially given that a large country like the U.S. can solve trade issues within its states rather than depending on foreign trade. Fan also noted that in 2018, U.S.-China trade war had three main effects on China: the devaluation of the Chinese yuan, capital flight, and a replacement of some Chinese exports. He predicted that if Trump imposes tariffs of 60% or more, these effects will likely repeat. In response to Trump's threat of new tariffs on Chinese goods, analysts believe that China could launch a currency war. One tool China has used in the past is to devalue the yuan against the US dollar. This makes Chinese products cheaper for foreign buyers, helping the offset of impact of US tariffs on China's competitiveness. The Chinese government did this in 2018 and 2019 when Trump's tariffs were first imposed. However, devaluating the yuan could harm China's economy. Chinese businesses and wealthy individuals might move their capital abroad rather than invest domestically to avoid losses from the falling currency. A weaker yuan could also undermine public confidence in China's economy, reducing consumer spending and causing stock market declines. This policy could also contradict China's recent efforts to stabilize the economy, as the real estate sector has already taken a heavy toll, wiping out much of the wealth of China's middle class. Associate researcher Wang Guochen at the Mainland China Division of the Chunhua Institution Economic Research said that while some Wall Street analysts suggest China should devalue the yuan in response to high tariffs, Beijing has been steadfast in maintaining the exchange rate in the past few years. He argued that manipulating the exchange rate is risky for China, and the government may not have the tools to deal with it if the yuan falls significantly. If the People's Bank of China cannot maintain the exchange rate, a sharp depreciation of the yuan could trigger a systematic financial crisis. Additionally, if China were seen to be manipulating this currency, Trump might designate China as a currency manipulator, leading to even more tariffs. In recent years, to avoid direct tariffs, Chinese authorities have resorted to obfuscating the origins of the goods. They export semi-finished goods to third countries like Mexico or Vietnam, where final processing and manufacturing are completed before the goods are shipped to the US. This allows Chinese products to bypass some of the tariffs imposed by the US. In his first term, Trump signed the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement to replace the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. Under this agreement, goods from Mexico and Canada that meet certain requirements could flow freely across the US without being subject to tariffs. The Chinese government, which was already grappling with the US-China trade war, saw an opportunity in this. It worked to strengthen trade ties with both Canada and Mexico, using them as backdoor routes to send Chinese products into the US market. Over the past few years, Chinese companies have invested heavily in building factories in Mexico. This followed them to label products as made in Mexico and ship them tariff-free to the US. For Chinese businesses, the US market has seen as too important to lose. Similarly, some Vietnamese importers have been found to repackage goods from China and label them as made in Vietnam, applying for Vietnamese certificates of origin before shipping them to the US, Europe, and Japan. This practice is part of a broader trade called nearshoring, where Chinese companies relocate production closer to their key market, especially to avoid logistical problems and geopolitical tensions and to bypass high US tariffs. In addition, the electronic products and electric vehicles, the Chinese also send components to Mexico for assembly that end up in products like fentanyl, a highly dangerous synthetic opioid. During both Trump's first term and the current Biden administration, the US and China have had multiple negotiations over the regulation of fentanyl. While there have been some collaborations, the US government has not been satisfied with Chinese efforts, and the cooperation has often been intermittent. Commentators believe that there are certain reasons for the Chinese Communist Party's lax control on fentanyl. Professor Xie Tian at the School of Business at the University of South Carolina said that not banning fentanyl can be used as a bargaining chip with the United States. China can declare that it will reduce some production or output in exchange for benefits from the United States. This strategy aligns with the Communist Party's ideology and patriotic education. Many Chinese believe that the opium wars in the late Qing dynasty caused great disaster for China, and now it is time for fentanyl to bring disaster to the US and the West. This is because fentanyl does not harm China domestically. Instead, it is exported to the US and the West, bringing China a large amount of foreign currency. On September 9, 2024, the Washington think tank, the Heritage Foundation, released a report about holding China accountable for the fentanyl crisis. During the discussion of the report, they mentioned former U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney's daughter, who died from fentanyl poisoning. The report claimed that the U.S. fentanyl crisis directly originates from the CCP. The report stated that Mexican drug cartels play the most visible and well-known role in the fentanyl crisis, but many Americans are unaware that the CCP is actively funding, supporting, and even driving the deadliest drug threat in the U.S. History. In April 2024, the U.S. House of Representatives Special Committee on the U.S.-China Strategic Competition published another significant report. It also cited China as the primary driver of the fentanyl crisis. This report revealed that the CCP is directly subsidizing the manufacturing and export of illegal fentanyl materials and has a tax rebate program that encourages the export of certain fentanyl precursors. Former U.S. Attorney General William Barr, speaking at a congressional hearing held by the committee, confirmed that nearly all of the illegal fentanyl precursors entering the U.S. are produced in China. He said that without China's production and export of fentanyl and fentanyl precursors, there would be no fentanyl crisis in the United States. Lawrence Kadish, a member of the board at the Gatestone Institute, wrote that fentanyl could be a weapon deliberately chosen by China to weaken the United States. He drew a direct connection between fentanyl and the well-known opium wars in Chinese history. Kadish argued that China's ruler have experienced the devastating effect of the opium wars, understand the insidious roles that drug can play in destabilizing a society. Mexico has long served as a conduit for Chinese products, including fentanyl, flowing into North America. This has led to repeated criticism from Trump, who recently warned Mexico of a 25% tariff. This move was effectively throwing cold water on the thriving trade relations between China and Mexico. In fact, the US-China trade war, now in its sixth year, has led many countries to shift their focus from China to Southeast Asia in order to mitigate geopolitical risk and supply chain vulnerabilities. Southeast Asia is increasingly seen as a new global factory and the new global market. Countries have rolled out various incentives, including subsidies, tax breaks, and other measures to attract manufacturing demand moving away from China. A Taiwanese businessman who has invested in China for over 20 years mentioned that due to the US-China trade war, the competitiveness of product manufactured in China has significantly decreased, with tariffs ranging from 20 to 50% on products exported from China to the US. Customers now prefer to import from other countries even if the price is 10% higher. Major U.S. tech companies like Dell, HP, and Apple are accelerating their decoupling from China. They're pushing their suppliers to significantly reduce the portion of products manufactured in China, especially those intended for the U.S. market. The goal is to shift 50% of the production capacity out of China by 2025. Countries like Vietnam have attracted major Taiwanese assembly companies such as Quanta, Compal, and Invectec due to favorable government policies and the support of big U.S. brands like Dell and Apple. India is also seeing major companies like Foxconn, Pegatron, and Wistron moving in. At the same time, many countries are looking to reduce their reliance on trade with China. According to official data from the German Federal Statistical Office, Germany's total trade with the US in the first quarter of 2024 reached 63 billion euros, surpassing its trade with China for the first time. In the first half of 2024, German exports to Poland has also exceeded those to China, making Poland Germany's fourth largest export market. This marks a significant shift as German companies work to reduce their dependency on the Chinese market. Even before taking office, Trump has made it clear that his administration will tackle the fentanyl crisis first, with a strategy to gradually dismantle Chinese trade relationships with North America and block all routes for Chinese products to enter into the US. The future for the Chinese economy looks increasingly bleak.